I would rather drown in debt with a man who dares to dream than spend another day suffocating in the absolute safety of your boring, predictable life, Julian. You were never suffocating me on purpose. That's what makes it worse.
She wanted adventure. I wanted a foundation that couldn't be wiped out by one bad turn.
I would rather drown in debt with a man who dares to dream than spend another day suffocating in the absolute safety of your boring, predictable life, Julian. Those were the exact words Bianca had thrown at my face 6 years ago, right before she packed her bags and walked out of our shared house in Brookside. She didn't yell them. She said them with a cold, quiet certainty that hurt far worse than any screamed insult. To her, my entire existence was a spreadsheet of calculated risks, a life lived in the margins of caution, completely devoid of the grand adventure she believed she deserved. And now, 6 years later, those words still echoed in the quiet corners of my mind as I sat on a hard plastic chair inside the municipal auditorium in Kansas City. The air in the hall was thick with the scent of cheap perfume, floor wax, and the nervous sweat of hundreds of families waiting to see their children walk across the stage. It was mid-May, the kind of humid Midwestern morning that made your shirt stick to your back the moment you stepped out of the car. I adjusted my tie, which felt a little too tight around my collar. I had bought a new suit for today, a charcoal gray one that the sales associate assured me looked modern, though on me, it probably just looked like another accountant's uniform. I didn't care about the suit, though. I only cared about Deja. My 21-year-old daughter was about to receive her degree, and as far as I was concerned, she was the only successful calculation I had ever made in my 45 years on this earth. I looked across the aisle, about 3 rows down and 5 seats over. There she was, Bianca. She looked radiant, as she always did when there was an audience. At 43, she had the kind of polished, effortless beauty that public relations directors seem to cultivate as a professional hazard. Her hair was styled in loose, perfect waves, and she was wearing a cream-colored dress that looked like it cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. She was laughing, her head tilted slightly back, whispering something into the ear of the man sitting next to her. The man was Preston Whitlock. Preston was 49, tall, with silvering hair at the temples and the posture of someone who had never had to look at a price tag in his life. He was wearing a bespoke navy suit, a gold watch glinting under the auditorium's harsh, fluorescent lights. He was the founder of a highly successful real estate investment fund here in Kansas City, or at least, that was the story everyone believed. To Bianca, he was the adventure she had always wanted. He was the man who dared to dream. As the crowd chuckled at a joke the university president made on stage, Bianca glanced over her shoulder. Her eyes swept across the crowded rows and landed on me. For a fraction of a second, her smile flickered. It was the same look she used to give me when I brought home the wrong brand of, groceries, a mixture of mild annoyance and deep, fundamental disappointment. She leaned over and whispered something to Preston, nodding slightly in my direction. Preston turned, offered me a brief, patronizing nod, and then turned back to the stage, wrapping an arm around Bianca's shoulders. I knew what she was telling him. She was probably saying, "That's Julian, still sitting alone, still wearing the same kind of tired face he wore when we were married." To Bianca and her high society friends, I was still the man she described as someone who only knows how to add and subtract other people's money. They had no idea. They didn't know that 3 weeks ago my independent auditing firm had been quietly retained by the regional branch of the Securities and Exchange Commission. They didn't know that I had been named the lead forensic accountant on a massive financial fraud investigation, and they certainly didn't know that the primary target of that investigation was a real estate fund that was currently raising millions of dollars from unsuspecting local investors. I had spent the last 22 years of my life as a forensic accountant. It's a job most people don't. Understand, When I tell people at parties what I do, their eyes usually glaze over. They think of tax returns, standard audits, and piles of dusty receipts. But forensic accounting isn't about counting money. It's about reconstructing human behavior. It's about finding the friction between what people say they did and what the numbers prove they actually did. In my line of work, we have a saying: people lie, documents can be forged, but the flow of money is like a physical trail of footprints in the mud. If you follow it long enough, with enough patience, it will always lead you to the truth. My patience had always been my greatest strength, and my marriage's greatest weakness. During our 11 years together, Bianca hated my caution. She wanted me to take our savings and invest in speculative real estate deals, to leverage our home to buy into high-yield funds her friends talked about. I always refused. I wanted a solid foundation. I wanted to pay off our mortgage, to secure Deja's college fund, and to build a life that couldn't be wiped out by a single bad turn in the market. To her, that was cowardice. To me, it was love. I took a deep breath, trying to push the old bitterness out of my chest. Today was about Deja, not the ghost of my failed marriage. I watched as the line of graduates began to move toward the stage. Deja was in the middle of the pack, her black cap sitting slightly tilted on her dark curls. When she caught my eye, she gave me a massive, unpolished grin and waved her rolled-up program. I felt a lump form in my throat. I raised my hand and waved back, a genuine smile finally breaking across my face. Just then, the phone in my breast pocket vibrated. I didn't want to look at it. I had promised myself I would keep my phone off during the ceremony, but the vibration didn't stop. It buzzed 3 times in quick succession, a signal we used in the office for urgent matters. I reached into my pocket, shielded the screen with my hand, and looked down. It was a text message from Marisol Vega. Marisol was 44, my closest colleague, and one of the sharpest forensic minds in the country. She was currently back at our office downtown, running the background checks on the shell companies associated with our active fraud case. The first message read, "Julian, I need you to look at these files before the graduation ceremony ends. It's urgent." I frowned, typing back a quick reply. "Can it wait? Deja is about to walk." A second later, the dots appeared on the screen as she typed. Her response made the warm air of the auditorium suddenly feel like ice. "Julian, I just finished cross-referencing the beneficial ownership registry for the primary shell companies holding the investor funds. Preston Whitlock is the sole legal signatory. His real estate fund is a complete sham. It's a Ponzi scheme, Julian. And you need to see who else is on this shareholder list before you talk to anyone." My heart did a strange, heavy thud against my ribs. I looked up from the screen, my eyes instantly darting back to the cream-colored dress 3 rows down. Bianca was still holding Preston's hand, her face lit up with pride as the announcer called out the next name on the graduation list. I looked back down at my phone. My thumb was trembling slightly as I typed, "Are you sure?" 100%, Marisol's reply came instantly. "The money is gone, Julian. He's been using new investor capital to pay off the old ones for the last 2 years. The whole thing is about to collapse. Do you want to step off the case? If you have a personal connection, we need to file the conflict of interest paperwork today, before the SEC moves in." I stared at the screen, the loud cheers of the families around me fading into a dull, distant hum. I was sitting less than 15 feet away from a man who was about to destroy the lives of dozens of people, and the woman who had left me because I was too safe was currently holding his hand, completely oblivious to the fact that her entire world was built on a foundation of stolen sand. The cheers of the crowd swelled around me as another name was called, but my hands remained frozen over my phone. I didn't reply to Marisol immediately. My mind, trained to process complex data streams under pressure, suddenly felt like an engine running without oil, grinding and sparking against itself. I looked back up at the stage, then over to Bianca. She was laughing, her hand resting lightly on Preston's forearm, her diamond-encrusted bracelet catching the light of the auditorium. It was a beautiful picture of success, the exact kind of life she had always told me she was meant to live. I leaned back in my hard chair, the cheap plastic creaking under my weight, and let my mind drift back to the foundation of this mess. My mother, Harriet, had always told me that I was a child who looked twice before crossing a dry street. She wasn't wrong. Caution was built into my DNA, a quiet inheritance from a father who worked 35 years at the post office, and a mother who kept our family's household budget in a black leather ledger on the kitchen table. When I chose forensic accounting, it wasn't just a career. It was an extension of my soul. I loved the order of it. I loved the idea that truth wasn't an opinion or a feeling, but something you could prove with enough time, ledger entries, and bank statements. During my 22 years in this field, I had developed a core philosophy. A good forensic accountant is never the person who makes the quickest conclusion. The rookies always want to find the smoking gun on day one. They look for the massive $1-million transfer that sticks out like a sore thumb. But real, professional thieves don't work that way. The most sophisticated financial frauds in history are hidden in plain sight, buried under mountains of ordinary, repetitive transactions that look so boring and routine that no one ever bothers to double-check them. They are hidden in the margins, in the small, decimal point discrepancies that are dismissed as rounded errors. Unfortunately, what made me a brilliant auditor made me an insufferable husband in Bianca's eyes. We had met in college. She was a journalism major with a fire in her eyes that I found terrifying and intoxicating. I was the quiet senior who helped her tutor kids in math. For a while, our differences were our strength. My stability grounded her flighty ambitions, and her energy dragged me out of my quiet shell. But as the years pressed on, and the reality of adult life settled in, those differences turned into cracks. Bianca wanted a life of grand gestures. She wanted the big house in the hills, the luxury SUVs, the weekend trips to Cabo, and the social circle that talked about venture capital and angel investments. I wanted a paid-off mortgage, a well-funded retirement account, and a guaranteed college fund for Deja. Every time she came home with a can't-lose investment opportunity suggested by one of her public relations clients, I would sit down at the dining table with a yellow legal pad and dismantle the offer line by line. I remember one night in particular, during our 8th year of marriage. She had come home glowing with excitement about a boutique hotel development project in downtown Kansas City. A friend of a friend was putting together a group of private investors, promising a 20% annual return. Bianca wanted us to take out a second mortgage on our Brookside home, the home we had worked so hard to buy, to fund the investment. I spent 4 hours that night reading through the offering memorandum. It was a masterpiece of marketing, filled with glossy renderings of rooftop bars and smiling young professionals. But when I looked at the underlying debt structure and the cash flow projections, the math simply didn't work. The project was over-leveraged, and the developers had no track record in commercial real estate. "We can't do this, Bianca," I had told her, setting my glasses down on the table. "The risk is far too high. If this project defaults, we lose the house. We lose everything we've built." She had stared at me, the light in her eyes dying out, replaced by a cold, simmering resentment. "You always do this, Julian," she said, her voice shaking. "You find a way to kill every spark of excitement before it even has a chance to catch fire. We are young. This is the time to take risks. This is how people actually build wealth. You live your entire life as if the sky is about to fall on us tomorrow." "I live my life trying to make sure we have a roof over our heads if the sky does fall," I replied quietly. She walked out of the room that night, and she never really came back. For the next 3 years, our marriage was a slow, silent erosion. She stopped sharing her dreams with me, and I stopped trying to explain the math to her. We became two people sharing a mortgage, united only by our fierce, shared love for our daughter, Deja. When she finally handed me the divorce papers 6 years ago, she did it with the same cold efficiency I used for my audits. She didn't want my retirement account, and she didn't want to fight over child support. She just wanted her freedom from what she called the prison of my caution. I didn't fight her. When someone tells you that your love feels like a suffocating blanket, the only decent thing you can do is pull it back and let them breathe. I signed the papers, packed my clothes, and moved into a modest 2-bedroom apartment near Plaza. I left her the Brookside house, which she sold a year later to put a down payment on a loft in the Crossroads district, a trendy area that suited her new, independent lifestyle. It was the first time in my life I had ever allowed a major financial asset to walk out of my hands without a fight, but I did it because I wanted her to be happy. And more than that, I wanted to protect Deja from a messy, protracted war. For 6 years, I watched from the sidelines as Bianca built her new life. She thrived in her career, eventually becoming the director of public relations for a major firm. And then, 3 years ago, she met Preston. Preston Whitlock was everything I was not. He was charming, wealthy, and lived a life of highly visible luxury. He was a regular in the local business magazines, hailed as a visionary real estate developer who was rethinking the Kansas City skyline. When Bianca married him 2 years ago, Deja had told me about the wedding with a mixture of excitement and caution, knowing how much it might hurt me. It did hurt, of course, but I kept my mouth shut and sent a polite card. Now, as I sat in the stuffy auditorium, staring at Preston's broad, tailored shoulders, the irony of it all settled into my stomach like a heavy, cold stone. The man who had rescued Bianca from my boring, predictable safety was about to drag her into a financial abyss. The visionary she had married was nothing more than a thief who had realized that it was far easier to steal people's dreams than to actually build them. My phone buzzed again in my hand. It was Marisol. "Julian, are you there? Do we file the conflict paperwork or not?" I looked up. On the stage, the announcer was approaching the O section of the alphabet. Deja was standing in line, just a few graduates away from the steps. She was looking out into the crowd, trying to find my face in the sea of parents. I closed my eyes for a brief second, the training of my entire career taking over. If I filed the conflict paperwork, I would be off the case immediately. Another team would take over. They would proceed with the standard SEC timeline, which meant an indictment in 4 to 6 weeks. Bianca and Preston would have time to prepare, or perhaps Preston would find a way to liquidate whatever assets he had left and flee the country, leaving Bianca to face the music alone. But more importantly, if I stepped away, I would lose the ability to see the true depth of the damage. I wouldn't be able to protect Bianca from the fallout, or to ensure that Deja's future wasn't completely ruined by the coming storm. I opened my eyes, looked at my daughter, and then typed my reply to Marisol. "Do not file the paperwork yet. Keep my name off the system for 48 hours. I need to see the ledger myself." The applause in the auditorium reached a deafening crescendo as Deja's name was finally called. I stood up, clapping so hard my palm stung, watching my 21-year-old daughter walk across the stage with her head held high. She accepted her diploma with a bright, confident smile that reminded me so much of her mother when we were young. Across the aisle, Bianca was standing too, wiping away a tear while Preston kept a comforting hand on her waist. At that moment, I forced myself to forget about the text messages burning a hole in my pocket. I wanted this memory to belong entirely to Deja. But the peace didn't last. Once the ceremony concluded, the massive crowd spilled out of the auditorium and onto the sun-baked concrete plaza outside. The heat of the afternoon hit us like a physical wall. Families were huddled in small groups, taking photos, laughing and shouting congratulations over the din of traffic. I stood near a brick planter, scanning the sea of faces until I saw Deja's black graduation cap bobbing through the crowd. She ran straight toward me, her gown fluttering behind her, and threw her arms around my neck. "You made it, Dad," she laughed, squeezing me tight. "I wouldn't miss this for anything in the world, Deja," I said, kissing the top of her head. "I am so incredibly proud of you." "Julian." The voice was smooth, polished, and immediately put me on guard. I looked up to see Bianca and Preston walking toward us. Bianca's eyes scanned my face, searching for any sign of the awkwardness that usually defined our brief interactions over the last 6 years. "Congratulations, sweetheart," Bianca said, pulling Deja into a tight hug. "You did it." "Thanks, Mom," Deja said, beaming. She stepped back, looking between me and her mother. "I'm so glad you guys are both here." Preston stepped forward, extending his hand toward me. His grip was firm, practiced, and dry, the handshake of a man who spent his life closing deals and commanding rooms. "Julian, it's a pleasure," Preston said, his voice carrying a rich, easy warmth. "Bianca has told me a lot about you, the quiet, analytical type. We need more of those in this world." "Nice to meet you, Preston," I replied, keeping my voice level, my eyes locked onto his. I wondered if he could feel the sudden tension in my hand, or if he was so insulated by his own arrogance that he couldn't imagine anyone looking at him with suspicion. "We're taking Deja out for an exclusive dinner at the Capitol Grill," Bianca said, her tone carrying a familiar edge of performance. She looked at my simple suit, then back to Preston. "Preston managed to book the private room. It's nearly impossible to get on graduation weekend, but he has connections with the management." "That sounds wonderful," I said, refusing to let her bait me into feeling small. "You guys should go and enjoy it." Preston offered a patronizing smile, patting Bianca's hand before slipping his hand into his trousers pocket. "Actually, Julian, Bianca mentioned you work in independent accounting. If you ever get tired of the routine tax audits and want to see how real money is moved, you should let me know. We have a new real estate investment circle opening up next month. It's strictly limited, by invitation only, but I could easily carve out a small slice for Bianca's family." I stared at him, the sheer audacity of his offer ringing in my ears. He was standing there in a $3,000 suit, offering to let me invest my hard-earned savings into a collapsing Ponzi scheme that I was currently investigating for federal authorities. "I appreciate the offer, Preston," I said quietly, keeping my face completely blank. "But I've always been a bit old-fashioned. I prefer to keep my money where the math is simple." Bianca rolled her eyes, a sharp, irritated gesture I had seen 1,000 times during our marriage. "Some things never change, Julian," she sighed. Turning to Deja. "Come on, sweetie, we need to beat the traffic to the plaza." They walked away, Preston's arm draped possessively over Bianca's shoulders. I watched them go, my mind racing. Preston's offering of a strictly limited opportunity was his classic playbook. According to the preliminary files Marisol had gathered, Preston had used this exact, exclusive, limited-time pressure tactic over the last 2 years to target more than 30 small, local investors across the Kansas City area. He preyed on their fear of missing out, promising high, guaranteed returns on local real estate. Developments that didn't actually exist. I waited until they were out of sight, then pulled out my phone and dialed Marisol's number. "I'm heading to the office now," I said when she answered. "Have the bank records ready." 30 minutes later, I walked into the quiet, air-conditioned offices of my firm downtown. The weekend staff had already left, leaving the corridors dark and silent. I made my way to the secure research lab at the back of the building, where Marisol was waiting. She was sitting in front of 3 large monitors, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, surrounded by empty coffee cups. "You didn't file the conflict papers?" she asked, looking up as I closed the heavy door behind me. "No," I said, pulling off my suit jacket and throwing it over a chair. "If I step down now, the case gets reassigned to a regional team that doesn't know the local players. They'll run a standard audit, and Preston will have weeks to move whatever liquid assets he has left to offshore accounts. I need to see the ledger myself." Marisol sighed but didn't argue. She knew me too well to try and talk me out of it. Instead, she clicked her mouse, bringing up a massive spreadsheet on the center screen. Here it is. These are the consolidated bank statements for Whitlock Enterprises and its primary subsidiary shell companies from the last 24 months. I pulled up a chair and leaned in, my glasses sliding slightly down my nose. My eyes instantly began to scan the rows of data, looking for the telltale signs of friction. It didn't take long to find. Preston's fund claimed to invest in multifamily housing developments in the Crossroads and West Bottoms districts. But when I looked at the cash outflows, there were no payments to construction companies, architectural firms, or city zoning offices. Instead, the money coming in from new investors was held in a central account for less than 48 hours before being wired out. Some of it went to pay older investors their promised monthly dividends, but a massive portion was being routed directly to personal credit card companies, luxury car dealerships, and high-end travel agencies. It was a classic, textbook Ponzi scheme. He wasn't building real estate, he was building a lifestyle. "Julian, look at this entry from 3 months ago," Marisol said, pointing to a wire transfer of $300,000. It came from a private account under the name of Clara Jenkins. I froze. Clara Jenkins was Bianca's best friend from her public relations firm. "Bianca introduced Clara to Preston last year," I whispered, the cold reality settling in my chest. Clara's husband passed away 2 years ago, and she was looking for a safe place to put her life savings to secure her kids' college funds. "Well, Preston took all of it," Marisol said quietly. "And look where it went. 2 days after Clara's deposit, Preston wired $280,000 to an older investor who had threatened to file a formal complaint with the state attorney general. Preston used Bianca's best friend's life savings to quiet down a whistleblower." My blood ran cold. Bianca hadn't just married a fraud. She had actively, though unconsciously, helped him target her own social circle. If this case went public, which it would very soon, she wouldn't just lose her husband. She would lose her reputation, her career, and the trust of every friend she had ever brought into Preston's orbit. The air in the secure research lab was cold, but my palms were damp as I stared at the documents Marisol had pulled up on the screen. The digital clock on the wall read 10:42 p.m. on Saturday. The 48-hour window I had negotiated with Marisol was already shrinking, and the weight of what we were uncovering felt heavier with every tick of the clock. "Julian, you need to look at the collateral agreements for the main loan from Apex Capital," Marisol said, her voice dropping to a quiet whisper that sounded far too loud in the empty office. She pointed a polished fingernail at a signature block on a scanned PDF file. Preston didn't just borrow money against his own shell companies. He secured a $1.2 million line of credit from Apex, and he had a co-guarantor. I leaned forward, my glasses nearly touching the monitor. My eyes scanned the legal names on the signature line, and for a second I forgot how to breathe. There it was, written in the elegant, looping cursive I would recognize anywhere. Bianca Osei Whitlock. She had signed the document as the primary co-guarantor, using her entire public relations agency, her personal bank accounts, and even the equity of her luxury loft in the Crossroads district as collateral. If Preston's fund collapsed, which was now an absolute mathematical certainty, Apex Capital would step in and liquidate every single asset Bianca owned. Her business, her savings, her home, her reputation, everything she had spent the last 6 years building after leaving me, would be wiped out in a single afternoon. But it was worse than just financial ruin. "Look at the dates, Julian," Marisol continued, her eyes reflecting the blue glow of the monitors. "The loan was finalized 6 months ago. The marketing materials her PR agency produced for Preston's fund were attached to this loan application as proof of future revenue. The SEC lawyers are going to look at this and see a coordinated effort. They won't just see a wife supporting her husband. They will see Bianca's agency as the active marketing arm of a fraudulent scheme. They will indict her as a co-conspirator." I felt a sickening wave of anger rise in my throat. Preston hadn't just married Bianca because he loved her. He had targeted her. He had realized that a respected, highly connected public relations executive was the perfect shield for his fraud. He had used her professional credibility to lure in victims like Clara Jenkins, and then he had manipulated her into signing documents that transferred all the legal and financial liability onto her shoulders. In my profession, we see this type of financial abuse all the time. Auditors call it the affinity fraud auxiliary. Con artists rarely work entirely alone. They find honest, ambitious people who are blinded by love or greed, and they turn them into unwitting accomplices. Preston had exploited Bianca's deep desire for a life of high-stakes adventure and grand gestures. He had given her the illusion of a brilliant, wealthy partnership, while quietly tying a financial noose around her neck. I leaned back in my chair, staring up at the dark acoustic tiles of the ceiling. The irony was a physical pain in my chest. Bianca had left me because she felt my cautious, structured life was a prison. She had run straight into the arms of a man who had built a literal legal cage for her, and she was currently sitting in a high-end restaurant on the plaza, toasting his success, completely unaware that the door was about to slam shut. My mind drifted back to the final year of our marriage, to a secret I had carried for over 6 years. During our 11th year together, before the word divorce had ever been spoken aloud, but when the silence in our house had already become unbearable, Bianca was drowning in stress. She had gone back to school to get her master's degree in communications, hoping it would help her secure a director-level position. She had taken out $45,000 in student loans to fund it, a debt she kept entirely separate from our household accounts because she was too proud to ask me for help. Every night, I would see her sitting at the kitchen table, crying silently over the interest statements and the monthly payment notices. She felt like a failure, and her frustration turned into anger directed at me. She accused me of not understanding her ambition, of being content with our small, quiet life, while she was suffocating under the weight of her debts. I had just received my annual performance bonus, the largest one of my career, totaling $50,000 after taxes. I had planned to use that money to make a massive principal payment on our mortgage, which would have brought us within 3 years of completely owning our home. It was the safe, calculated move I'd been planning for years. Instead, I called the loan servicer. I spent 3 days navigating the bank's administrative bureaucracy to arrange an anonymous third-party payoff. I wanted her to have her freedom from that debt, but I knew her pride. If she knew the money came from me, she would have seen it as an act of pity, a husband trying to buy her loyalty or prove his financial superiority. So I arranged for the bank to send her an official notice stating that her account had been cleared due to an administrative restructuring and matching educational grant program associated with her university. I still remember the morning she received that letter. She was ecstatic. She danced around the kitchen, laughing, calling her friends to tell them that her hard work and academic record had finally paid off. She looked at me with a triumphant smile and said, "See, Julian, sometimes you just have to trust that things will work out. You don't have to calculate every single penny to be successful." I had smiled, nodded, and told her how proud I was of her. I never told her the truth. I let her keep her victory, even when she used that very success as evidence that my caution was unnecessary. 3 months later, she asked for a divorce. "Julian?" Marisol's voice broke my train of thought. "We are running out of time. If we don't file the conflict forms by Monday morning, the Internal Affairs Division of the SEC will flag your relationship to Bianca the moment the formal indictment is drafted. It will look like you were trying to protect her. It could ruin your career. You could lose your license." "I know," I said, rubbing my tired eyes. "I need some air, Marisol. I'll be back in an hour." I grabbed my car keys and walked out of the office. The night air was cool and crisp, a welcome relief from the stuffy atmosphere of the research lab. I drove aimlessly through the quiet streets of Kansas City, the streetlights reflecting off the hood of my car. Without realizing it, I found myself steering toward the historic northeast side of the city, pulling up in front of the modest, white-sided bungalow where my mother, Harriet, had lived for the last 40 years. Even at midnight, the porch light was on. I walked up the wooden steps, the floorboards creaking familiarly under my feet, and knocked gently on the door. A moment later, the door opened, and my mother stood there, wearing a warm, knitted shawl over her nightgown. She looked small, her hair completely silver now, but her eyes were as sharp and clear as they had always been. "Julian," she said, showing no surprise at seeing her 45-year-old son on her porch at midnight. "Come inside, son. The tea is still warm." I sat at the small kitchen table, the same table where she had taught me how to balance a checkbook 30 years ago. I told her everything. I told her about Preston's fraud, about the 48-hour clock, and about the collateral agreements that would destroy Bianca's life. My mother listened in silence, her hands wrapped around a ceramic mug. When I finished, she let out a long, slow sigh. "Julian," she said quietly, "you've spent your whole life looking at the world through numbers. You think that if you can make the columns balance, you can keep everyone safe. But people aren't numbers. Bianca made her choice 6 years ago. She chose a path of risk and excitement. And now she has to face the reality of that path." "I know, Ma," I said, looking down at my hands. "But Deja's future is tied to this too. If Bianca goes bankrupt or gets indicted, it will destroy Deja. And I can't just stand by and watch Bianca drown when I have the tools to pull her out." My mother reached across the table and placed her warm, wrinkled hand over mine. "You always were a protector, Julian. You paid off her student loans all those years ago because you loved her enough to let her leave without a burden. You didn't do it for credit. You did it because it was the right thing to do. And you are going to help her now for the same reason." She smiled gently, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "You don't save a drowning person because they were kind to you, Julian. You do it because you are the one standing on the dock with the rope in your hand. Now, go back to your office and figure out how to untangle this mess." I stood up, feeling the heavy fog of exhaustion and doubt finally begin to lift from my mind. "Thanks, Ma." "And Julian," she called out as I reached the door, "make sure you save some of that caution for yourself. Preston Whitlock is a cornered beast, and beasts bite when they are trapped." I nodded, walked back to my car, and drove back toward the downtown skyline. The clock was still ticking, but I finally knew exactly what I had to do. The clock on the wall of our secure research lab showed 1:15 a.m. when I got back to my desk. The silence of the empty office building was heavy, punctuated only by the low hum of the server racks in the corner. Marisol Vega, my closest colleague on this investigation, looked up from her screen, her eyes bloodshot but sharp. She had a fresh cup of black coffee waiting for me on the corner of my desk. I took it, nodding my thanks, and sat down. I didn't waste any time. The 48-hour clock was ticking, and we needed to map out every single vein of Preston Whitlock's fraudulent network. I pulled my keyboard closer and opened the primary digital file directory for Whitlock Enterprises. My training as a forensic accountant had taught me that a fraudster's mind leaves its clearest patterns in the way they organize their lies. They build layers, like an architect trying to hide a secret room behind a series of false walls. For the next 4 hours, Marisol and I worked in near silence, our fingers typing rhythmically. We began to trace the movement of the investor funds from the moment they were deposited into Preston's primary account. What we found was a complex, interlocking web of transactions designed to do one thing: obscure the source and destination of the money. Preston had established 4 main shell companies, all registered under generic names like Midwest Development Holdings and Riverfront Property Partners. On paper, these companies were supposed to be purchasing commercial real estate properties, in the Crossroads district of Kansas City. But when I pulled the municipal property registries for those addresses, the owners were entirely different entities. Preston hadn't bought a single square foot of land. Instead, he was using fake lease agreements and forged purchase contracts to show his investors that their money was being put to work. "Julian, look at this," Marisol said, breaking the silence. She dragged a spreadsheet onto my screen. "I'm tracking the cash flow from the Midwest Development Holdings account. Every time a new investor deposits money, exactly 30% of that deposit is immediately transferred to a separate personal account registered in the Cayman Islands. But it's not registered under Preston's name." I squinted at the account details. "Whose name is on it?" "It's registered under a nominee corporation called B&W Consulting," Marisol replied, her voice grim. "And the sole listed owner of B&W Consulting is Bianca." A cold knot of dread tightened in my stomach. Preston wasn't just using Bianca's public relations firm to market his fake investments. He was actively setting her up to take the fall for the offshore. Money laundering. If the SEC investigators followed the money trail, they would see millions of dollars flowing from defrauded Kansas City investors directly into an offshore account owned by Bianca. To any outside investigator, it would look like Bianca was the mastermind who was pocketing the stolen funds while Preston was just the local face of the operation. "He's framing her, Marisol," I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. "He's building a paper trail that points directly to her. If he gets wind of the investigation, he can pack his bags, leave the country, and let her face the federal prosecutors alone." "But why would she sign those corporate registration papers for B&W Consulting?" Marisol asked, shaking her head. "She's a smart woman, Julian. She runs her own agency. How could she not know she was signing ownership papers for an offshore consulting firm?" "Because she trusted him," I said quietly, looking at the scanned documents on my screen. "And because Preston is a master of administrative manipulation." I opened the PDF file of the corporate registration for B&W Consulting. I scrolled down to the signature page. The signature was Bianca's, but when I looked closer at the document metadata and the page layout, the truth became obvious. The signature page was a direct copy of a standard employment contract that Bianca had signed for her public relations agency years ago. Preston had digitally lifted her signature from an old PDF file and pasted it onto the offshore corporate documents. It was a forgery, but it was a highly sophisticated digital forgery that would take a forensic document examiner weeks to prove. To the untrained eye of a standard SEC auditor, it was an open and shut case of a co-conspiracy. "We need to prove the digital forgery now," I told Marisol, my voice carrying a new urgency. "If we can't prove that Preston forged her signature on these offshore accounts before the indictment is finalized, the federal prosecutors will freeze all of Bianca's assets on day one. They'll arrest her alongside Preston." We began to dig into the system logs of the computer servers at Whitlock Enterprises. As forensic accountants, our job often overlaps with digital forensics. We don't just look at the numbers, we look at the digital footprints left by the people who entered them. I ran an IP address trace on the digital uploads for the B&W Consulting registry files. The results were undeniable. The files had been uploaded to the registry website at 3:14 a.m. on a Tuesday 3 months ago. The IP address used to upload the files belonged to Preston's personal laptop, which was connected to the wireless network at a luxury hotel in Chicago, where he was supposedly attending a real estate conference alone. Bianca was back in Kansas City at the time, working at her agency. "We have him," Marisol said, a small, triumphant smile playing on her lips. "The digital metadata proves Bianca wasn't even in the same state when the account was registered. It was all Preston." "It's a start," I agreed, but I couldn't share her enthusiasm. "But it's not enough to stop the freight train that's coming. The SEC is going to look at the total picture. Even if she didn't know about the offshore account, she still signed the loan agreements for Apex Capital. She still brought in investors like Clara Jenkins." The thought of Clara Jenkins made my chest ache. I remembered Clara from our old days in Brookside. She was a gentle, quiet woman who had lost her husband to cancer. She had trusted Bianca implicitly, and Bianca, believing she was helping her best friend secure her family's future, had handed Clara's life savings over to a monster. I looked at the clock. It was 5:45 a.m. The first light of Sunday morning was beginning to filter through the blinds, casting long gray shadows across the desk. My 48-hour window was halfway gone. "Marisol, go home and get some sleep," I said, rubbing the back of my neck. "You've done incredible work tonight. I'll stay and compile the digital forensic report." "Julian, you need to sleep too," she said, looking at me with concern. "You've been running on adrenaline since the graduation ceremony yesterday." "I'll sleep when this is over," I replied. "Right now, I need to make sure this report is so airtight that the federal prosecutors can't ignore it." Once Marisol left, the office became completely silent. I sat alone in the dim light of the monitors, my fingers moving steadily across the keyboard as I built the forensic exhibit. I documented the forged signatures, the Chicago IP addresses, the routing of Clara Jenkins' money to quiet the whistleblower, and the systematic manipulation of Bianca's assets. As I worked, I realized that my mother Harriet was right. I couldn't save Bianca from the emotional fallout of her choices. She would still have to face the devastating realization that her marriage was a lie, and that her husband was a criminal. She would still have to face her friends, her clients, and her daughter Deja with the truth. But I could save her from the prison cell Preston had built for her. I could ensure that when the dust cleared, she still had her freedom, her agency, and a chance to rebuild her life. It was the only calculation that mattered now. I saved the final draft of the forensic report to our secure server, locked the research lab, and walked out into the cool, quiet morning of Kansas City. The air was fresh, and the streets were completely empty. I drove back to my apartment, knowing that tomorrow the storm would finally break. 3 weeks after the graduation ceremony, the Midwest Regional Office of the Securities and Exchange Commission in downtown Kansas City was packed to its absolute capacity. The air in the second-floor briefing room was thick with the low, anxious murmur of local journalists, legal representatives, and dozens of everyday investors who had gathered under the glare of television camera lights. The room was cold, the air conditioning blasting to combat the heat of the summer morning outside, but the atmosphere inside was incredibly tense. I stood behind the double doors of the presentation stage, adjusting my glasses and looking through the small glass pane. My charcoal suit felt heavy. In my hands, I held a thick, blue leather folder containing the consolidated forensic accounting report, the culmination of hundreds of hours of sleepless nights, tracing bank records, analyzing digital metadata, and mapping out a network of financial deceit that had robbed local families of over $40 million. In the third row of the auditorium, sitting near the center aisle, was Bianca. She was dressed in a dark gray tailored suit, her hair pulled back into a tight, professional bun. She looked pale, her skin almost translucent under the harsh fluorescent lights of the briefing room. Her fingers were wrapped so tightly around the straps of her leather handbag that her knuckles were white. She was alone. There was no Preston beside her. He had been taken into federal custody at 6 o'clock that morning at their Crossroads loft, arrested by federal marshals while Bianca was still in her bathrobe. She had come to the SEC office because she had been summoned, but also because she still didn't understand the depth of the betrayal. She believed there had been a massive administrative mistake. She believed her brilliant, wealthy husband was the victim of a regulatory misunderstanding, and she had brought her agency's crisis management team to help clear his name. She had no idea that I was the lead investigator. "We are ready, Julian," Marisol whispered, stepping up beside me. She offered a quiet, supportive nod. "The federal prosecutors have signed off on the presentation. The media is waiting. Let's lay it all out." I took a deep breath, pushed open the double doors, and walked onto the stage. As I took my place behind the wooden podium, the room fell silent, save for the rapid clicking of camera shutters. I adjusted the microphone, looking directly out into the crowd. I didn't search for Bianca's eyes, but I felt the exact moment she recognized me. I heard a faint, sharp intake of air from the third row. From the corner of my eye, I saw her lean forward, her mouth slightly open, her eyes widening in absolute, paralyzed shock. To Bianca, I was the man who only knew how to add and subtract other people's money. I was the boring, predictable ex-husband who was too afraid of risk to ever achieve anything grand. Yet there I was, standing at the podium of a federal briefing room, with the seal of the United States government behind me, and a room full of national journalists waiting for my every word. "Good morning," I began, my voice sounding calm and steady through the audio system. "My name is Julian Osei, and I am the lead forensic accountant assigned to the federal task force investigating Whitlock Enterprises and its associated entities. Over the past several months, our team has conducted a comprehensive forensic audit of the financial records, bank accounts, and digital registries of the real estate investment funds managed by Preston Whitlock." I clicked the remote control in my hand, and the massive projector screen behind me lit up with a complex cash flow diagram. It wasn't a glossy marketing slide with beautiful renderings of luxury apartments. It was a cold, brutal map of bank accounts, wire routing numbers, and transfer dates. "What you see on this screen," I continued, pointing to the diagram, "is not a real estate investment fund. It is a textbook Ponzi scheme. Over a 24-month period, Whitlock Enterprises raised approximately $42 million from 34 individual investors in the Kansas City metropolitan area. The marketing materials promised that these funds were being used to acquire and develop commercial properties in the Crossroads and West Bottoms districts." I clicked the remote again, bringing up a side-by-side comparison of the fund's promotional booklets and its actual bank records. However, our forensic investigation reveals that not a single dollar of investor capital was ever used for property acquisition, architectural design, construction, or municipal permitting. Instead, the incoming funds were routed through a series of local shell companies, including Midwest Development Holdings and Riverfront Property Partners, before being dispersed in two primary directions. I paused, letting the silence in the room settle. I glanced down at my notes, then looked directly at the crowd. First, approximately $12 million was used to pay fictitious monthly dividends to older investors. This was done solely to maintain the illusion of a highly profitable enterprise and to encourage those investors to recruit their friends and family members. Second, and more critically, over $30 million of investor funds was systematically diverted to fund the personal lifestyle of Preston Whitlock. Murmurs broke out across the room. Several journalists began typing furiously on their laptops. These diverted funds were used to pay for luxury vehicle leases, private jet charters, high-end travel, and exclusive jewelry, I said, my voice remaining flat and professional. Furthermore, our investigation has identified a specific transfer of $300,000 deposited by Clara Jenkins, which was used within 48 hours to pay off an early investor who had threatened to report Whitlock Enterprises to the state attorney general. From the third row, I heard a quiet, broken sob. Bianca had buried her face in her hands. She knew Clara. She had been the one who convinced Clara to trust Preston with her late husband's life savings. Hearing the clinical, mathematical proof of how her best friend had been betrayed was a blow that seemed to physically shatter her. But I wasn't finished. I had to deliver the most critical part of the presentation, the part I had spent 48 hours of sleepless analysis to prove. In addition to the local shell companies, I said, bringing up a new slide showing the offshore accounts, the investigation identified an entity registered in the Cayman Islands under the name B&W Consulting. This entity held over $5 million of stolen investor funds. On paper, the sole legal signatory and owner of this offshore account was listed as Bianca Osei Whitlock. The cameras flared again, several reporters turning to look around the room, trying to identify if Bianca was present. Bianca sat frozen, her face completely drained of color. She looked like a woman who was watching her own execution. However, I continued, raising my voice slightly to command the room's attention, our digital forensic team conducted a metadata analysis on the corporate registry files and the signature pages of B&W Consulting. We have conclusively proven that the signature of Bianca Osei Whitlock was digitally forged. The digital signature was lifted from an old, unrelated employment contract and pasted onto the offshore corporate documents without her knowledge or consent. I clicked the slide, showing the technical IP address logs that Marisol and I had untangled. The digital registry files were uploaded from an IP address registered to a laptop owned exclusively by Preston Whitlock, while he was attending a conference in Chicago. Ms. Osei Whitlock was not present and had no access to the registry portal. Our report has officially cleared Ms. Osei Whitlock of any active complicity or criminal intent in the establishment and operation of B&W Consulting. She was an unwitting participant, manipulated by her husband, who used her professional credibility and forged her identity to build a legal shield for his own crimes. The room erupted into a flurry of questions, but I simply stepped back from the podium, handing the microphone over to the lead federal prosecutor. I looked down at Bianca one last time. She was staring up at me through a veil of tears, her face a mask of confusion, grief, and a sudden, overwhelming realization. The man she had dismissed as small and insignificant had just used the very caution she hated to dismantle her husband's empire, and in doing so, he had saved her from a federal prison. The evening after the press conference, the thunderstorm that had been threatening Kansas City all afternoon finally broke. Rain lashed against the high glass windows of my office building, blurring the yellow streetlights of downtown into long, glowing streaks. The office was mostly dark, save for the single desk lamp illuminating my workspace. I was packing up my briefcase, feeling a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The adrenaline that had carried me through the morning presentation had completely evaporated, leaving behind a dull ache in my temples. A soft, hesitant knock on the glass door made me look up. Bianca was standing in the doorway. She was still wearing the gray tailored suit from the morning, but her professional composure was entirely gone. Her hair was slightly damp from the rain, and her eyes were red and heavily swollen. She looked smaller than she had in years, stripped of the glossy, confident armor she usually wore so effortlessly. "Julian," she whispered, her voice cracking slightly. "Can I come in?" "Of course," I said, setting my briefcase down on the desk. "Come in, Bianca." She walked into the office, her steps slow and uncertain. She didn't sit in the leather chair opposite my desk. Instead, she walked over to the window, staring out at the rain-slicked streets below. For several minutes, the only sound in the room was the steady, rhythmic patter of water against the glass. When she finally turned to face me, her expression was a painful mix of anger, confusion, and raw panic. "Why didn't you tell me, Julian?" she asked, her voice trembling as she tried to hold back tears. "You sat there at Deja's graduation. You shook Preston's hand. You looked me in the eye, knowing that my entire life, my business, my home, everything was about to be destroyed. Why did you let me walk into this buzzsaw without a single word of warning?" I looked at her, my heart heavy, but my voice steady. "Because I didn't know for certain until that very morning, Bianca. When I sat down in that auditorium, I had only just received the preliminary shareholder match from Marisol, and even if I had suspected it weeks before, I couldn't say a word. I am a forensic accountant bound by federal non-disclosure laws and strict professional ethics. If I had tipped you off, it would have been a federal crime. Preston would have known we were onto him. He would have liquidated B&W Consulting and fled the country, leaving you to face the conspiracy charges completely alone." I walked around the desk, standing a few feet away from her. "The only way to save you from a prison cell was to build a case so airtight that the federal prosecutors could see, without a shadow of a doubt, that your signature was forged. I had to let the investigation play out. I had to let Preston believe he was safe, so we could trace his digital footprints back to his laptop in Chicago. If I had warned you, you would have confronted him. He would have covered his tracks, and you would be in federal custody right now. Bianca stared at me, her chest heaving as she processed my words. The anger in her eyes slowly began to dissolve, replaced by a devastating, hollow realization. She sank slowly into the leather chair, burying her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook as she began to sob, not the quiet, controlled tears of public embarrassment, but the deep, shattering cries of a woman who had realized her entire reality was a lie. Psychologists often refer to this dynamic as the asymmetry of projection. In many relationships, when one partner quietly and consistently shoulders the entire weight of security, budgeting, and risk mitigation, the other partner is freed to view that very safety as a suffocating cage rather than a foundation. They mistake the absence of chaos for a lack of ambition. If you have ever been in a position where you broke your back to keep your family safe, only to have them resent you for the very stability you provided, you understand how deeply that hurts. If you've lived through that, write a comment below and let me know how you survived the silence. For 6 years, Bianca had projected her need for excitement onto Preston's flashy, high-stakes lifestyle, believing she had finally found a partner who dared to dream. She had looked back at our 11 years of marriage as a waste of her youth, a prison of caution. Now she was realizing that the gatekeeper of her safety had always been the man she left behind. "I went to see your mother last week, Julian," Bianca whispered, her voice muffled by her hands. She wiped her eyes with a damp tissue, looking up at me with an expression of intense vulnerability. I was so stressed about the rumors surrounding Preston's competitors, and I wanted Harriet to convince you to look into their finances, to see if they were trying to smear Preston's name. I thought you were just being stubborn, as usual. She paused, a fresh wave of tears spilling over her eyelashes. Harriet didn't give me any financial advice. She just looked at me with so much pity. And then she told me about the $45,000. She told me how you paid off my student loans right before we divorced. I froze. The old secret suddenly laid bare between us. I hadn't wanted her to ever find out. "Why didn't you tell me, Julian?" she sobbed, her voice breaking completely. "I spent 6 years believing I was this strong, independent success story who had conquered my debts through sheer luck and academic grants. I used that luck to justify leaving you. I told myself that my success proved your cautious budgeting was unnecessary. I mocked you to my friends. I called you small-minded. And all this time, it was your money. It was your annual bonus. You bought my freedom, and you let me walk away believing I did it myself." "I did it because I loved you, Bianca," I said quietly, looking down at the worn carpet. "And because I knew your pride. If I had told you, you would have felt obligated to stay, or you would have seen it as an attempt to buy your love. Our marriage was already over. I wanted you to have a fresh start, without the crushing weight of that debt holding you down. I didn't do it for credit. I did it because it was the right thing to do." Bianca covered her mouth, her tears flowing freely now. "I was so foolish," she whispered. "I mistook your stability for smallness. I thought because you didn't shout your achievements from the rooftops, you didn't have any. Preston shouted everything. He made me feel like we were conquering the world. But he was just hollow. He was a thief, Julian. He stole my life, and he would have let me go to jail for him." "You are not going to jail," I said, my voice firm and resolute. "The forensic report clears you of B&W Consulting, but you have a very difficult road ahead, Bianca. Apex Capital is going to liquidate your assets to satisfy the loan collateral. Your agency is going to face massive public relations fallout. You will have to look Clara Jenkins in the eye and tell her the truth." Bianca nodded slowly, her expression turning somber. "I know. I've already called Clara. It was the hardest conversation of my life. She was angry, Julian. She has every right to be. I'm going to sell my jewelry, my car, whatever I have left, to try and help her. But it won't be enough." She stood up, walking over to me. For the first time in 6 years, she looked at me not as a boring ex-husband, but as the only solid, honest thing left in her world. She reached out, her hand trembling as she touched my forearm. "Thank you, Julian, for saving me, even when I didn't deserve it." "I didn't do it just for you," I said gently, placing my hand over Han's. "I did it for Deja, and because, despite everything, you are still the mother of my daughter." She offered a weak, grateful smile, turned, and walked out of the office into the rainy night. I watched her go, knowing that the physical and legal battle was just beginning. Her assets would be frozen, her reputation would be tested, and she would have to rebuild her entire life from scratch. The post-breakthrough collapse had begun, but for the first time, she was walking into the storm with her eyes wide open. 6 months after the federal authorities moved in, the autumn leaves in Kansas City had turned a brilliant, fiery orange, carpeting the sidewalks of Brookside in layers of gold and amber. The sweltering summer heat that had witnessed the collapse of Preston Whitlock's empire was long gone, replaced by the crisp, cool air of late November. The legal machinery of the federal government was slow, but it was relentless. Preston had been formally indicted on more than 12 severe counts of investment fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering. Facing the mountain of undeniable forensic evidence that my team and I had compiled, his high-priced defense lawyers quickly realized they had no cards left to play. Preston spent his days in a federal holding facility, his polished charisma completely useless against the dry, clinical ledger entries that proved his guilt. He was currently negotiating a plea deal that would likely see him spend the next 15 to 20 years of his life in a federal penitentiary. Bianca had cooperated fully with the federal investigators from the very beginning. Once the initial shock of the arrest wore off, and she saw the forged signatures on the Cayman Islands accounts, she realized how close she had come to losing her freedom. She spent dozens of hours sitting in cold, windowless conference rooms at the SEC offices, patiently answering questions, handing over her agency's promotional archives, and detailing every interaction she had ever facilitated between Preston and local investors. Because of her complete transparency and the airtight digital forensic report we had provided, the Department of Justice officially declined to file any criminal charges against her. But the lack of an indictment did not mean she escaped without scars. The financial fallout was swift and total. Apex Capital moved quickly to liquidate the collateral she had unwittingly guaranteed. Her luxury loft in the Crossroads district was sold at auction, and her public relations agency was forced into a structured bankruptcy to pay off outstanding debts and legal fees. She had to move into a small, rented 2-bedroom apartment in a much less fashionable part of town. She sold her luxury SUV, her expensive jewelry, and almost all the designer clothes that had once defined her high society lifestyle. Yet, the most painful liquidation was not financial. It was social. Bianca had to look her friends and colleagues in the eye and admit that she had brought a predator into their lives. Clara Jenkins eventually agreed to speak with her, but their friendship would never be the same. The trust was shattered, and no amount of apologies or liquidated jewelry could instantly restore the life savings Clara had lost, even though the federal receiver was now working to distribute Preston's frozen assets back to the victims. On a quiet Sunday evening in late November, my mother, Harriet, did something she had not done in over 6 years. She picked up the phone and invited Bianca to come to her house for Sunday dinner. When Bianca arrived at the modest bungalow on the northeast side of the city, she looked nervous, her fingers clutching a simple paper bag containing a loaf of home-baked bread. She stood on the porch, hesitant to knock, until Harriet opened the door herself. "Come inside, Bianca," Harriet said, her voice warm and welcoming, showing none of the tension that had existed between them since the divorce. "The kitchen is warm." Harriet, I don't know what to say, Bianca whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears as she stepped into the hallway. After everything I said about Julian, after the shame I brought to this family, I didn't think you would ever want to see me again. Harriet stopped, turning to look at her former daughter-in-law. She placed a gentle, firm hand on Bianca's shoulder. You made mistakes, Bianca. You let your ambition blind you to the truth, and you paid a very high price for that. But you are still the mother of my grandchild, Deja. That makes you family, whether you are married to my son or not. Now, wash your hands. The roast is almost ready. We sat around the same wooden kitchen table where I had balanced my first checkbook as a teenager. Deja sat between Bianca and me, her face glowing with a quiet, peaceful happiness that I hadn't seen in years. For the first time since the divorce, there was no performative boasting, no passive-aggressive comments, and no underlying resentment. We talked about Deja's new job at a local marketing firm, about Harriet's garden, and about the simple, ordinary details of daily life. After dinner, while Harriet and Deja were in the kitchen washing the dishes, Bianca and I stepped out onto the back porch. The air was cold, and we could see our breath rising in faint, white plumes under the yellow porch light. I used to think this porch was so small, Julian, Bianca said quietly, wrapping her woolen coat tightly around her shoulders. She looked out at the small backyard where Deja used to play on a wooden swing set. I used to sit here and dream about massive terraces overlooking the city, about hosting lavish parties with people who talked about millions of dollars. I thought that was what it meant to actually live. And now? I asked, leaning against the wooden railing. And now I realize that the grander the house, the easier it is to hide the lies, she said, offering a sad, quiet smile. I was so busy looking at the horizon that I didn't see the foundation cracking right under my feet. I spent 6 years running away from your caution, Julian, because I thought it was a cage. I didn't realize that your caution was the only thing keeping the roof from falling on our heads. We were both young, Bianca, I said gently, and we wanted different things. I wanted security because of how I grew up, and you wanted adventure. There's nothing wrong with wanting adventure. The mistake was trusting a man who offered it without a foundation. She nodded slowly, her hand resting on the wooden railing next to mine. We talked to Deja yesterday, together. It was the first time we told her the complete, honest truth about why we split up, without any of the old anger. She deserved to know the real version of her parents. She deserved to know that her father is a man of quiet, immense strength, and her mother is a woman who had to learn the hard way how to value the truth. She's a strong girl, I smiled. She gets that from both of us. No, Bianca whispered, looking up at me with deep sincerity. She gets her resilience from you. I'm just glad she has your DNA to guide her when the world gets too loud. A few weeks later, on a quiet afternoon near the end of the year, Bianca, Deja, and I drove past our old house in Brookside. The home had been sold to a young couple with 2 small children, and we could see a colorful plastic tricycle parked on the driveway where my old sedan used to sit. The house looked different. The new owners had painted the shutters a bright, welcoming blue, but the neighborhood still felt exactly the same. We parked the car along the curb, a few houses down, and walked along the sidewalk. As we passed our old property, Deja stopped, pointing to the 2 young maple trees planted near the edge of the lawn. We had planted those trees during our 5th year of marriage, when they were nothing more than thin, fragile saplings held up by wooden stakes and green garden wire. Bianca had complained at the time, wanting to hire a professional landscaper to plant mature oaks instead. She had argued that the maples would take too long to grow, that we would be old before we ever saw any real shade. But now, 16 years later, those maples stood tall and magnificent. Their thick trunks rooted deep into the soil, their broad branches reaching toward the sky. They had survived ice storms, summer droughts, and the changing of the seasons, growing quietly, inch by inch, completely unnoticed by the people who lived beneath them. "They're beautiful, aren't they?" Bianca murmured, stepping closer to touch the rough bark of the larger tree. "They are," I replied, standing beside her. "They just needed time." In my line of work, I have spent a lifetime analyzing the friction of human behavior through the cold medium of numbers. I have seen how easily people can be deceived by a flashy ledger, a glossy prospectus, or a charming smile. But I have also learned that the most valuable things in this life, trust, security, and true, enduring love, cannot be calculated on a spreadsheet, and they cannot be built overnight. The caution of a quiet partner is not a sign of smallness or a lack of ambition. Sometimes it is the highest, most profound form of love, a quiet, daily commitment to build a foundation so strong that the people you care about will always have a safe place to land when their grandest dreams fall apart. The truth always has a way of finding its way home, no matter how deep it is buried, and no matter how long it takes. To everyone reading this story tonight, if you have someone in your life who quietly manages the budget, who double-checks the lock on the front door, who worries about the rainy day fund, or who insists on reading the fine print before you sign your name, do not resent their caution. Do not mistake their stability for a lack of imagination. Tonight, when you go home, take a moment to look them in the eye and say thank you. Because in a world full of people who dare to dream, the most precious thing you can ever find is the person who dares to keep you safe. Type agree in the comments if you believe that a